Hey everybody, so this is the last in our lecture series on thermoregulation, and we're going to be talking about thermoregulation in plants. So just to recap where we've gone with how organisms deal with temperature, we've talked about cellular level adaptations that organisms have specifically in their membranes and their proteins to deal with thermoregulation and variation in the environmental temperatures. We've also talked about how animals thermoregulate and the difference between endotherms versus ectotherms and how those organisms thermoregulate, and some specific adaptations that organisms or specifically animals have to thermoregulate. So we've talked about behavioral adaptations, structural adaptations, and physiological adaptations. If you've not yet seen the lectures that cover this material, please make sure that you watch those lectures first before you get into this material, what we're going to talk about today, which is how plants thermoregulate or regulate their temperature and some of the adaptations they have to help them accomplish this. So I want to reiterate that temperature matters for all organisms, and that's true not just for animals, but plants as well. And so this graph right here just looks at how temperature affects different important organismal responses in plants, whether we're talking about growth rate, the activity of particular enzymes in this plant, the ability of this plant to respire. So remember, plants also do cellular respiration to produce ATP and energy. And plants also, of course, do photosynthesis. And all of these rates in this particular species of plant, or all of these responses, have a particular temperature where they work optimally. There's optimal photosynthesis at this temperature, optimal enzyme activity at this temperature, optimal growth at this temperature, optimal respiration at this temperature. And outside of those ranges, these rates decrease. And so it's important for a plant to maintain a sort of optimum temperature range for all of these things that are listed right here, because high temperatures can influence plant growth rate, seed germination, crop quality, yield reduction, alternation and timing of seeding, alteration in photosynthesis. And so all of these things are really important, not only for the life of a plant and its ability to reproduce and produce offspring, but also if you're a farmer, your ability to produce crops and things like that. So temperature regulation really matters for plants. And plants have the distinct sort of challenge that, unlike animals, plants can't move. So animals, if they overheat, they can go to a new spot to sort of cool off. Plants can't move to thermoregulate. And as a result, many plants can live in temperature extremes and often have broad temperature tolerances. So, for example, you can look at these bristlecone pine trees that survive in the desert. They can survive extremely, extremely hot temperatures and extremely, extremely cold temperatures. Huge temperature range that they're able to survive through. And I know this tree looks dead over here on the left, but it is in fact alive. So you often see very broad temperature tolerances, and plants have evolved to have these broad temperature tolerances because, once again, they can't move to thermoregulate. But that being said, these temperature tolerances are not infinite, and some plants are more limited in their temperature tolerances. For example, many tropical plants are not resistant to freezing. If they get into freezing temperatures, they die immediately. They haven't evolved any adaptations to help them deal with freezing. And we'll sometimes see this in desert plants as well. So desert plants have a lot of adaptations to deal with hot, dry conditions, but if they cool off too much or get a really, really hard freeze, a lot of desert plants can't resist those hard freezes. So each species of plant has evolved to live at a particular sort of range of temperatures, and they have structural and physiological adaptations that allow them to do this. And all plants, despite being stuck in one place, do have the ability to thermoregulate or regulate their temperature. Not in the same regard as animals do. They're able to tolerate a much larger range of temperatures, but they can still thermoregulate. And they have particular ways that they can do this, whether it's reorienting the leaves or transpiration. But it's not as extensive of thermoregulation, not as precise as thermoregulation, because they don't have the ability to move. So let's talk about some of those adaptations that plants have for wide temperature tolerances. So for example, if you look at plants from areas that are seasonal areas, so if you have summer or spring, summer, fall, and winter, plants from these areas with seasons can actually increase the amount of unsaturated fatty acid contents of their cellular membranes as temperatures drop. Okay, so remember from previous lectures that if you increase the amount of unsaturated fatty acids in your cellular membranes, you get more of these little kinky tails. That means that the fatty acids are not packed as closely together, and the membranes therefore are more permeable. So remember, as temperatures cool, membranes tend to stiffen and get harder. It's almost like they're being sort of frozen down, even though they're not frozen. They're just getting harder and solidifying. And so it's important for them to be more permeable and have more of these unsaturated tails in these colder temperatures. And what we found is that over the lifetime of an individual plant, some of these plants that have evolved in these seasonal habitats can actually change their membrane composition over time so that those membranes remain fluid at whatever temperature it is in their environment. So they'll increase the amount of unsaturated fatty acids in their membranes. And this is in opposition to plants that are native to areas with little seasonal temperature change. So tropical plants, if you're in the tropics, you don't have the seasons. It kind of stays warmish year-round, at least not the same seasons as we consider them. So you won't have a spring, winter, and fall. And a lot of those plants that have evolved in these temperate or tropical climates will not be able to change their membrane compositions. And that's part of the reason that when you move some of these tropical plants into cool environments, they'll die when they get cold because they just can't deal with those freezing temperatures. Other plant adaptations for dealing with excessive heat include evaporative cooling through transpiration. So remember, we talked about plants doing evapotranspiration, where basically they'll suck up water from the roots and the ground and move that up through the leaves. That evapotranspiration creates this sort of suction as leaves heat up, water gets sucked out. So this is called transpiration. Basically, water is released through the stomata and the leaves. When that water is released, there's also a little bit of evaporative cooling that goes down. And so plants will use this evaporative cooling that results from transpiration to help actually cool the plant down. One of the big issues with this, though, is that plants often don't have an unlimited supply of water. And this is an especially large issue if you're in a really, really hot place like a desert, okay? So what this big issue of how to reduce excessive transpiration if there's not a lot of water. So plants are trying to cool off, or they're cooling off a lot from this transpiration process, but they're losing too much water. So how do you sort of reduce this water loss? Is you have to, in turn, plants have to reduce their heat gain. And they have a couple adaptations to help them reduce the overall heat gain so that they're transpiring less and not overheating. And one of these things is they've evolved hairs to reflect solar radiation, like the hairs that you can see on this leaf right here. Basically what that does is those act like little tiny mini shades, little mini umbrellas that cover the leaves on a microscopic level and help to reflect some of the solar radiation so the plant itself doesn't heat up. The hairs sort of absorb that heat. And you can see a microscopic picture of what those hairs sort of look like if you look at it on a microscopic scale. The other thing is plants throughout the day can actually change their leaf orientation so that, during the hottest parts of the day, and throughout the day, they can reorient the leaves so they're not getting absolute direct rays of the sun and not overheating and not losing too much water as well. Other plant adaptations to deal with excessive cold include dormancy. So dormancy is basically just when plants get too cold, they can stop their growth and overwinter in a sort of dormant state. And they can do this either by dropping their leaves or slowing down their growth. So in this image that we're looking at here on the left, you can see a bunch of aspen trees that have dropped their leaves, and you can see some pine trees that still have their needles on them. The needles are, in fact, the leaves. But in all of these trees, they're basically in a dormant state where they've slowed down their growth. One really nice thing about dropping leaves, if you're a deciduous tree, so deciduous trees are trees that drop their leaves, is water is typically unavailable in the wintertime in places that have a strong winter, simply because all the water's frozen up due to that cool season. And basically dropping those leaves reduces your transpiration, and you can deal with those colder temperatures. So if you get rid of the leaves, you don't have to worry about sucking a bunch of water up into the leaves on times when it's warm enough to do that, and then the plants can actually have that water freeze inside the branches, and that can be really bad for the plant to freeze like that. And so they'll go into this dormant state where they won't grow and they don't have to have access to water, and they won't require the same sort of they can survive those lower temperatures. The other thing that a plant can do is just have dormant life stages like we see in this perennial plant. So basically in the summertime, it's a big plant. And when the fall comes, the plant dies. So the plant completely dies off, except it drops some seeds. So this is basically a life stage that can sort of sit out through the winter. And then when spring comes, those seeds can germinate and grow. The other thing that plants can do is this plant, for example, has these things. It's called hibernacles, but it's basically just it's leaving some little roots or tubers down there that can get below the frost line, survive through the winter in this sort of dormant stage, and then those can pop out these little things called ramets. But it's just acting like a dormant life stage, and then it'll grow up into an adult plant in the summer as well. So those are just a very few of the adaptations that plants have to thermoregulate. They can alter their membrane composition. They can transpire, and that allows evaporative cooling. They can use hairs and leaf orientation to sort of reduce water loss when they're transpiring, but not just to reduce water loss, but also to reduce the overall amount of heat that's taken in to help with that process of transpiration, and also to keep them from overheating. And of course, plants can remain dormant as well.